Well, it is that time of year where I am starting to see fungus popping up all in our neighborhood. And so I always try to sync up when we talk about fungus and plants at the same time of year that we can actually go out and go see them. So, why do we study fungus in botany? Well, the reason for that is very simple. It is because fungus and plants have a very tight relationship. More than 80% of all plants on Earth have a fungal relationship in their root structure. And so, this here, these little nodules on the roots of this plant, this is called mycorrhizae. And what this fungus can do, fungus and there's also a bacterial relationship, but what it can do is it can obtain nitrogen from the soil, and it can capture it and convert it into a form that plants can use. Okay, so it grows on or in the roots, and without nitrogen, plants can't survive. Every living thing needs to have nitrogen, and there's lots of atmospheric nitrogen, but that's not available to plants to use. Okay, so the reason why I'm going to talk about it is because of that. The other thing that this fungal sheath does is it allows a tremendous amount of water to also be held, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's another aspect of it, is that fungus associated with your roots actually gives you greater ability to absorb and hold water if you're a plant. So it's kind of a way of like extending your root system without having to actually physically grow the root. And of course, the question is, why would fungus do that? I'll talk about that a little bit. So mycology is the study of fungus. Myco is the Latin word for mushroom, and fungi have been on the earth for a very long time. They are one of the oldest organisms, and if you want to know more about fungus and their history, go watch the TED Talk that I'm going to put up in the fungus folder, okay? The structure of a fungus. So they have cell walls that are made up of chitin, and chitin is a long chain polymer carbohydrate. Okay, so plant cell walls are made of cellulose. Fungus cell walls are made up of chitin. So, and chitin is super tough. Mycelium only grows at the apical end, which is the longest point. So this is some mycelium growing on some tree bark. And most of what we would consider a fungus grows underneath the ground or out of our eyesight. So this young fellow here is sitting in a what is called a fairy ring. And what you don't get here is that the fungus is all underneath the ground, and then these are the fruiting bodies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I keep going. How fungus eat? Well, they do two things. They use an enzyme to break down materials, and then they absorb that directly through their mycelium, through their hyphae. It's called extracellular digestion. So this is a really common mold that grows on citrus. Okay. So what do they eat? Well, they're either one of two categories, which is they either eat dead things or they're parasitic, and which means they grow inside of something and then they eat that thing. So this is an example of cordyceps, and this is the fungus that's actually growing out of this insect, right? These are the fruiting bodies coming out of it. And I'll also have a link to a video that talks a little bit about cordyceps and how that works. But basically, the insect ends up breathing in the fungus. The fungus grows all through the insect's body, consuming it while it's alive, and then eventually it pops out of it at the end of the insect's life cycle. So Fungus don't have, there's no like male or female designation. They're genetically the same pretty much, except one is considered a plus and one is considered a minus. And so what happens is when a plus mycelia meets a minus mycelia, they merge and then they exchange genetic material. And then once that happens, they create a reproductive structure. So here's a little fungus life cycle. So this is showing you how you have the plus and minus here, and this is haploid. It's got one set of genetic information, and then they fuse, and now this is diploid, and then it's going to make a fungus. It's going to put out spores, and then these spores will drop and be plus and minus spores that will then grow mycelium again. So they have a pretty trippy life cycle. Fungus are the great recyclers of nitrogen and carbon. Without them, the world would be full of all kinds of disgusting things that were not rotting. And because fungus mycelium all looks the same, there's not like different colors, and it doesn't look any different. Fungus are classified based on their reproductive structure. And what their reproductive structure is what we typically think of when we think of a fungus. So this is a reproductive structure. This is reproductive structure. This is reproductive structure. So one of the oldest type of fungus is the Chytridiomycota. It's a water fungus. They have gametes that can swim. So this is an electron microscope. So this is like the slime that grows inside, like it grows on the walls of your shower. It's like that pink slime that you see. So that is what that is. Zycomycota, they make something called a sporangium. And I will show you a picture of what that looks like. So this little thing here is the sporangia. This is blown up, right? This is really large. So when you see mold on the outside of bread, that is a sporangia. And what you have to understand is if there's mold on the outside of the bread, there's mycelium growing all through the bread, because you don't make your reproductive structure, which is what we see with our eyes, until you've actually consumed the majority of whatever it is that you're growing in or on. So this is the same for bread or moldy cheese or whatever. It means that it's growing through it, which is sometimes why, like, even if you cut off the moldy part of cheese and you eat it, it still tastes a little bit different because you've actually changed the chemistry inside of it because it's got fungus growing through it. So Ascomycota has a sac-like fungal structure. It looks like this. And yeast, which is, of course, really important in terms of making bread and making beer and making wine. Like, it's really tied up with human culture and what we can do. You know, last spring, people couldn't buy yeast because it was all getting bought up, and that's why people started sourdough, right? Because sourdough, you can capture wild yeast from the air and then just feed it something, flour and a little bit of water, and you will eventually get enough yeast so that you can actually bake bread with it. Basidiomycota is what we typically think of as mushrooms. So this is a Basidiomycota. It means club. Basidio means club because this looks like a little club. Deuteromycota are asexual and they make conidiophores. So, for example, ringworm, which is not a worm but is actually a fungus, is caused by this particular type of fungal infection. Lichens are part fungus and part plant. It's usually a sac fungus, an algae, or a bacteria. I did just hear this past weekend that there is more. It potentially is like two funguses and an algae, which is pretty wild. And so this is showing you a blow up of that. And lichens are really important because they can grow on all kinds of things, including rocks. right? And this is an electron. This is a close-up on a dissection scope. So, could you tell these two mushrooms apart? They both have the little things at the top, right? The little lifty-uppy things. So this one over here will give you bloody diarrhea, and this one over here is delicious to eat. So I know enough about fungus to know that you really don't want to pick them unless you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. Awesome things we get from fungus. All of these are awesome things that we get from fungus, okay? But there are also some diseases and some very scary things. Ergotism, which I know my third period talked about, is a fungus that makes you lose your mind, and it grows on rye. It looks like this. And there are also a couple other ones. There's something on valley fever that's caused by a soil fungus. So parts of a mushroom in general, there's the cap, there are the gills, that's where the spores are. There's the annulus. A lot of them have this little thing right here called an annulus. And then they have the stipe, which is the last part. And then the very last thing on this slideshow is, I'll post a link to this. It is the Pilobolus fungus, which is one of the fastest organisms in the world. Done.